I wrote my first book, The Alley Pimps. As you mentioned, it's a bit misleading to say that it took 10 years because I wrote it and then I sat on it, but I was always revising it. It never went anywhere, and it was laborious. That was tough to get that done. And I had tried many times to write a second book because, again, like I've said, I've always tried to write, but I'd never really finished anything that was of any length, and I always wanted to. And so I had been talking to Sean and Dave for a while, and I knew what machines they were, that they just did it. There wasn't a lot of like artistic chin scratching and so that attitude was in my head. And I knew that the new publishing landscape allowed for shorter books because you weren't trying to meet something that would have a print length that would fit on a shelf or whatever. And so I gave myself permission to just tell as quick and simple of a story as I could and not linger over it. Just keep it moving.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 302 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. If you're paying attention to when this came out in the feed, this episode's coming out on Wednesday, May 3rd, 2023. And for those who really pay attention, normally episodes come out on Friday, so I'm slipping in an extra episode. Yes, I have so many great interviews in the backlog. I'm trying to get more of them out rather than waiting. And so this is one of the weeks where you're going to get two episodes, one today on May 3rd and one in a couple days on May 5th. Or if you're backlog listening, well, you don't really notice, except maybe there's extra episodes, yes, for you, dear you listener. And for you, today, dear listener, I have an interview with Johnny B. Truant. Now, Johnny B. Truant is the best-selling author of Fat Vampire, adapted by SyFy as Reginald the Vampire, starring Spider-Man's Jacob Batalon. His other books include Pretty Killer, Pattern Black, Invasion, The Beam, Dead City, and over 100 titles across many genres. Now, for those of you who reflect on things, you may remember Joanna Penn's reflection in episode 300. You may even remember Johnny's reflection in episode 300. Johnny reflected on storytelling, but Joanna reflected on longevity. And that's one of the things I'm most fascinated by with Johnny B. Truant. Johnny, like Joanna, was one of those earliest voices in the self-publishing sphere, 2010, 2011, etc., etc. And Johnny was part of Johnny, Sean, and Dave of the self-publishing podcast, one of the first or earliest podcasts about self-publishing. Now, they've gone through many iterations over the years of various podcasts and things that they've been doing, but the one thing that Johnny, Sean, and Dave have never given up is their dedication to writing. And I think that persistence, that continued practice is so critical. And so that's why I'm thrilled to have this interview with Johnny here today. But before we get into that, let's hear a word from this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. Now, Findaway Voices is a great platform for audiobooks, and I want to share an announcement that came out on May 1st, 2023. Spotify helps authors earn more with Findaway Voices. Now, starting in May 2023, Findaway Voices is going to waive the Spotify distribution fees. Great news for authors. Spotify is excited to announce there'll be no 20% Findaway Voices distribution fee for audiobook royalties with Spotify. Findaway Voices' pricing structure for audiobook distribution is a very simple 80-20 share where you keep 80% of your royalties. Now, their standard 80-20 pricing will remain the same for all other partners, except for Spotify, where they no longer charge a 20% distribution fee. Now, they want to pass on cost savings efficiencies that are realized through Findaway Voice's integration with Spotify. And they're still committed to helping authors reach a wide audience through the retail and library partners they choose to work with. And why should you care about no distribution fee on an author's Spotify earnings? Because Spotify now offers the highest royalty you can make selling your audiobook with Findaway Voices. When your audiobook is sold on Spotify, now you receive all of the 50% of the list price you set. Authors can find a new audience on Spotify who recently announced that its global monthly active listeners are now 515 million strong. The news that royalties on the Spotify platform will be increasing is exciting, said Aaron Wright, USA Today bestselling author and creator of Wide for the Win. This will help the indie author's audiobooks become more profitable even faster. I'm looking forward to building my readership up on Spotify. For authors currently distributing to Spotify with Findaway Voices, you will see this take effect in the April sales report you will receive later in May of 2023. And if you've been thinking about going wide with your audiobook, now is the time to find your new audience on Spotify. Haven't made an audiobook? Now is the time to log on to Findaway's marketplace, find a perfect narrator for your book, and build a new audience on Spotify and other retail and library partners. And now is a great time to go wide with your audiobooks. Foster your new audience on Spotify and 43 other retail and library platforms, and grow your audience with an audiobook business partner that's constantly growing for you. And if you want to learn more about Findaway Voices, you can check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. I'm going to be getting to comments, etc. in the next episode, just coming up in a couple days. So I'm going to skip personal update. I am going to skip the comments, and I'm going to get right into this interview with Johnny B. Truant. Hey, Johnny, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Hey, Mark, it's great to be here. We've certainly known each other in many other contexts, and I haven't seen you on your home turf ever, really. So that's great.
Oh, yeah, look at that, with all the skulls and everything behind me. So
Right.
I'm so thrilled to talk to you about, what you've been up to since the days we first met, which were, I had some hair on my head. And I think you had, when we first met, even though I don't know if it was officially in person, you had one book to your name. You have a lot more books to your name. You have a TV series to your name. And you also have this whole production studio that you and Sean and Dave and some other people have put together. But I want to go back to the beginning for anyone who's not familiar. So Johnny B. Truant wanted to be a writer one day. When did that all start for you?
I've always wanted to be a writer. So way back in the day in my high school, there was I was on the high school newspaper, and I convinced them to do a column. There's probably people on this who are like, what's a column? I don't even know. That's an old newspaper thing. Just kind of a fun, it was basically a way of being creative rather than just lunch prices are up 25 cents or something like that. And I remember writing, before I could really kind of put coherent thoughts together, and just thought something was cool because somebody got blown up on an electric fence, and I remember typing on my grandmother's typewriter. That's how far back it goes.
Wow.
And I always wanted to be a writer, but there was no clear path to that back then. You needed to kind of have the lightning strike of all lightning strikes and be awesome. And there was this whole process of, querying agents and basically a lot of asking for permission for anybody to take a chance. And so, it kind of got to the point where I said, that's just, I don't know, I need to put food on the table. And so I embarked on an entirely separate career and only circled back when the indie movement started and I didn't have to go through that gauntlet.
Yeah. So, I think my first encounter with you was with a lot of authors in the community might have been through that indie movement, and you and Sean and Dave. And when did you launch the self-publishing podcast? That was, Lindsay Baroker had a podcast, Joanna Penn had a podcast.
Yeah, we were one of the first.
Yeah, it was like one of the first podcasts, but was that 2010 or 11 that you
Well, I published Fat Vampire in 2012, and that was my second book. And the idea for that came from a discussion with Sean and Dave. So I'm thinking it was probably 2011, maybe,
Yeah,
when we
okay.
launched that. I mean, it was called the Self-Publishing Podcast. We had selfpublishingpodcast.com. I mean, what does that tell you? Like, good luck getting that, identity now.
That was hilarious. So it was basically the three of you. Now, you and Sean met through copywriting, or what was that? How did you
Sean and
connect?
I orbited a lot of the same internet circles. So he wrote guest posts for copyblogger.com and other sites. And I wrote sites for copyblogger.com because it was the blogging boom. And that was
Right.
how, you got attention and you got people to figure out what you were doing. And so we would see each other's bylines. And then when we went to a blog world, back, I think, yeah, if it still exists, it's not called Blog World. It's like New World Media Expo, which I don't even know if that's still around. But when we first ran across each other, at those things, you run across people you internet know. And, oh, I know that person and I know that person. And Sean and I just ended up talking. And I don't know. I mean, Sean, other people who don't know Sean might not know kind of how billion miles an hour he is and how likable he is and how big his personality is. And we kind of hit it off. And then from there, it was, I just kind of stayed in touch. And when I found out that Sean and Dave were doing this indie publishing thing, I tried to glom onto it as much as I could. And that's where the podcast came from, was my desire to hop aboard the train of what they were doing. But I couldn't say that was the way to do it. Like, I can't be like, hey guys, teach me everything you know. So I said, let me come on and be the voice of like a newbie who I had one book and it
Right.
was, I did it the traditional way, or I attempted to. And so I said, if we can do this podcast, then I can act like the person who doesn't really know anything and I can ask you questions. But really, it was just me trying to get in there and get aboard that train.
And it was such this great relationship that the three of you have, like the dialogue and stuff. And so I really want to get into that because you came from this traditional publishing, typewriter, submissions, agents,
Yeah.
with the Pimps, which is more like a literary style novel.
Well, it's that first book that everyone does where you just vomit out everything that's in you, and it tries to be the great American novel. It tries to be every genre you've ever been interested in. It's psychoanalysis on the page.
And you had approached this, and I think Sean and Dave had Yesterday's Gone, which is a post-apocalyptic serialized back, pre-serialization is a thing, right? Like way back in the pioneering days. You guys are pioneers in so many ways. And then there was a joke. And so I think this is really important, is the spark of the joke on the podcast. You guys just turn on the mic and just kind of let her rip. Mm-hmm. And you not only went from, the guy with you work for, you have to work on a novel for years and years, and you just cranked out Fat Vampire. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit a couple things about that. They're still my favorite books of yours. And I know you've written dozens and dozens more. And there's something about the character Reginald that you just really love the guy. And I think Liz, my partner, she loved them too. She just, and I think there's something interesting when you hear the title Fat Vampire. It sounds like it's going to be an SNL skit that's funny for about 30 seconds and then is dumb for the next 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But it's not at all. It has such heart and passion, and I don't know what it is. So you suddenly did this, and then you wrote 6 books. I mean, following this character. Can you talk about like what, I know you've told the story probably countless times, but I just think it's important for writers to understand where that spark came from and what you did with it.
Well, so the spark came on, we had sort of an after hours podcast to the self-publishing podcast. So we did the self-publishing podcast, and then we would stay on for a show that was originally called, it's right in your wheelhouse, it was called Better Off Undead. And the thought was that the one thing that Sean, Dave, and I had in common most consistently was a horror element to some of our stuff. Like, sci-fi horror or actual horror or whatever. That was what we had in common. So the thinking was, let's do a podcast about horror tropes, horror movies, something like that. And then horror fans would listen to that podcast and then they would buy our books. And that didn't work for a few reasons. One, because we just never really stuck with it long enough in that vein. And number two, because it quickly just became a ridiculous show that had nothing to do with horror. But for the first maybe 24 episodes, if that, it was nominally a horror series.
Right.
And so I think we were talking about it. I don't really remember, but I think we were talking about what, I don't know, different types of classic monsters, or which one would we be? And so, Dave probably made a joke about being a zombie because he's up at night, or maybe he was a vampire because he was up at night. And then Dave, in his typical self-effacing way, if you don't know Dave, started joking about, well, I couldn't be a vampire because, I'd never catch my prey because Dave isn't exactly an exerciser. And it became this whole thing of, because Dave he's just always made fun of himself. And so I started to think about, like, well, okay, so if Dave did become a vampire, then, any self-loathing that he has would be locked in because he couldn't change anything. And vampires always go back to how they are. If they lose an arm, it comes back. If they get a cut, it heals. But nobody had ever, that I had seen, had explored that idea of sameness taken to the extreme. Like, you literally can't change. Although in Interview with the Vampire, there's that scene where the little girl cuts off her hair and it grows back. So there, we've seen that to some degree, but this idea of the fat vampire, and the one thing I do want to say here is that it's a title that can look real body shaming and fat phobic, but it's definitely not intended that way. It's supposed to be an ironic title because within the story, if you keep reading it, it's the glitzy, glamorous Twilight style vampires who say he's not good enough, and they call him the fat vampire. That's them dismissing him as he's just a fat vampire. And so, just by the way, a real quick side note that I thought was really funny was, after, I'm skipping ahead here, but it became a TV show, and so there's this show called, it's actually a Canadian show, so maybe you know it. Do you know Working Moms?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the first season of Working Moms, there's this character who's like this layabout husband character who, never really gets a job, and he's always kind of pursuing something. And in the first season, he's a writer, and he's trying to get things going. And he has this whole little speech where he says, vampires, they've been everything, they've been this, they've been that, they've never been fat. And I was like, oh, snap. Like, I need this show to get out there. And I was like checking, when was this show? When was the Working Moms episode? When did it air? Yeah. And when did my book publish? Because I wanted to make sure that that I beat them. And by the way, there was a book that predated mine called Fat Vampire. You can't copyright a title. Total and complete accident. I didn't know until after I hit publish.
Right.
That side story sort of derailed me. Help me get back on the tracks, Mark. So where was I going with this?
Well, I think you were talking about the fact that the title sounds like it's going to be offensive to people who are well nourished, and it's not. It's something that I think that's where the heart comes from. We feel with Reginald because we've been excluded because of the way we look or where we come from or who we are, right? And I think there's something there. So that's what you were exploring in Fat Vampire, I think. That's
the magic of that. So I had been doing, I wrote my first book, The Bialy Pimps. As you mentioned, it's a bit misleading to say that it took 10 years because I wrote it and then I sat on it, but I was always revising it and never went anywhere. And it was laborious. Like, that was tough to get that done. And I had tried many times to write a second book because, again, like I've said, I've always tried to write, but I'd never really finished anything that of any length, and I always wanted to. And so when we had this idea on the podcast, this is the story I didn't totally finish. I had been talking to Sean and Dave for a while, and I knew what machines they were, that they just did it. There wasn't a lot of like artistic chin scratching and so that attitude was in my head. And I knew that the new publishing landscape allowed for shorter books because you weren't trying to meet something that would have a print length that would fit on a shelf or whatever. And so I gave myself permission to just tell as quick and simple of a story as I could and not linger over it, just keep it moving. And the first book is only, I think, 25,000 words. That's really short for, if you don't know book lengths. It's at least a third or less than most, full length books.
Right.
But one of the things that was also a great crutch was it was a joke. Like I started with this great tinderbox of easy jokes to make. that Dave and Sean and I had already discussed. And so that it started, writing is so much about like the confidence to move forward for me, and knowing that I still had these jokes that I could make, that I could have him. I mean, there's a gag that I was really relieved to see that I had written it when I saw it in the show and liked it. And it's the thing where he's like, he can't get this guy to like, he can't bite him and feed on him. So he offers him money.
Yes.
And, that was something like, I knew I could make those things funny. And so that kept me going. And then I got to a point where I realized some of the things just kind of come out of me. So the idea of, I knew that he was going to be excluded, and that kind of evolved into this idea of an assessment that he would have to take, that he wasn't good enough. And I had no idea how to end it. And that was always the hard part for me, was I can build up a really good case, but then where does it go? And I remember really thinking about how that would work. But I had seeded clues along the way without knowing that I'd done it, which is what I do all the time. So he's reading books really fast. The idea is you get so much enhancement from your vampirism. And so instead of making you glamorous like you're ready for a cover model GQ shoot, all his went into his brain. It's a truly deeper waters beneath the surface sort of a message. And so he ends up using his brain to outsmart his enemies. And by the way, it was really important to me that the way that he ended up defeating them, which I won't spoil for people if you're going to read it, could not have been done by a slim vampire. Like your traditional slim Robert Pattinson style vampire could not have done what he did. He needed to be a big guy to pull it off. That was real important. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it started as a joke, but then it became very quickly this other thing. And then once the first book was done, I thought I was finished, but people wanted to have a sequel. And the bigger world just became an extension of that. My books always become this big statement about something if I let them go on long enough.
And that went for 6 books, right? And the later ones were more than 25,000 words. They got a little bit longer as you kept going, right?
Yeah. I would say that the 6th book is probably a classic full-length book. The 5th one might be 2, because then I had my feet under me by then. I knew the characters, I knew the world, I had an idea of what I wanted to do with it.
So right now, in retrospect, we can go, oh, and then Johnny wrote this book, and then Hollywood called, and now he's famous, yada, yada, yada. No. What happened was 10 years happened. And you didn't just sit back resting on your laurels of the 6-book series and the other novel you had written. You were just, I don't know, write, publish, repeat?
Yeah, write, publish, repeat. Yeah, I think it's impossible to get a total number of my books just because of the way that we recombined them. But I'm confident now that it's over 100. If you know all the pen names and all the ins and outs, and you break them up logically, it's over 100. Fat Vampire was a bit of lightning in the bottle. It was popular pretty quickly, and that was nice. I think it was a little easier to get eyes on things and to be popular and be noticed back then. Right. It remained one of my most interesting series to people, my most popular ones, which is probably why I picked it up. But yes, it wasn't feeding me in and of itself. And even when it had big months, they weren't going to last. I think the 4th and 5th books, like those were when I finally had a month that was a full-time income by my definitions. Right. And so, but I knew that I wasn't going to keep getting those months. So I had to keep producing, and we did. Invasion was another really big one, but and when I say we, this is almost entirely me and Sean. I've written very few books on my own. It's a lot harder for me to write them on my own and a lot less fun. But yes, that's exactly right. We just kept going.
Wow. So I want to get to the Hollywood, the Cinderella story, because, and here's the thing that was fascinating. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the executives who discovered the book about to get on a plane. And I'm thinking, okay, an airport shop where they grab a mass market paperback and then it becomes Virgin River or whatever, right, on vacation. Yeah. But no, that probably browsing on their Apple iPad, found Fat Vampire on Apple Books. And you got some calls, people reached out and said, hey, is this available?
Yeah, and it was so a couple of things there. So there are a few things that I always mention when this comes up. The first is the title is I mean, I lucked into that title. Like that is a really eye-catching title. Whether you love it or hate it, it makes you go, I want to know more.
Right.
Now, this is skipping ahead too. I think they made a mistake by calling it Reginald the Vampire. I get why they did it, but I think it was a mistake because it lost all of that immediate, like, ooh, I want to know what that show is.
Yeah, because it's like, what's Reginald? Although Reginald the Vampire is not, Maurice, which is sexy and sleek and stuff like that. Right? So it's like
it does
Reginald.
have that going for it. It does have that going for it, and it has Jacob Batalon going for it, which is
it does. Yeah, perfect casting too. I mean, honestly, wow.
Not one that I saw, but once I saw him do it, I said, okay, yep, he works.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, considering the previous roles I'd seen him in, but it worked really, really well. I want to talk about that too once we get to that. About
for
how
sure.
It's a completely different product, and you embrace that it was never going to be your books.
Yes,
and yet I think there's so much of the same heart.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Let me give you the second thing though that I about this executive is it was on Apple Books.
Yeah.
And, I know that you can appreciate this because I originally knew you as Mark from Kobo, but so many people do, because we're talking to authors here, I would imagine. And so many people do that Amazon exclusivity thing for KDP Select. And I always hated that. Like, even when we tried to play that game, the idea of you can only sell here and we will hamstring you, by the way, if you don't only sell here. Like, that just feels manipulative and like bad business. But this is one reason that I tell people, because I think it helps to justify it, is Amazon, because Amazon has so much exclusive content, because it's where a lot of the churn and burn happens, and the people who are just, because some people are really sincere artists and some people are just like, I figured out how to game the system. And the fact that there's no gatekeepers means there's a lot of, frankly, garbage sometimes, is that Amazon kind of becomes a dumpster fire to people who are legit looking for something really good to read. And so this is, and I've heard this several times we've had inquiries on other books that have come from Apple. And I think that a lot of the serious readers, and especially people who know story and do it for a living, like these network people, I think that they gravitate towards something like, in this case, it was Apple, because it's done the curation for them. Like, most people don't do it. And they found it on Apple Books. They didn't find it on Amazon.
Wow, that is amazing. And you did, if I'm not mistaken, I remember early on you had the first book was free, and then prices on the rest of the series. Was it even a free book at the time? Maybe it was in an Apple free promotion. I don't know. I can't.
Well, to my knowledge, we never got actual Apple promotions, meaning we talked to reps or anything like that for Fat Vampire.
Right.
I don't know if it was free, but free has changed too. Like, it's so much is free now. Like, that's a technique everyone knows. And it was easier to get noticed if it was free. I don't know if it was.
Right.
It's gone back and forth.
So you get this call from the Hollywood producer who's interested in optioning. And we both know that a lot of books, I mean, good friends of mine have had books optioned for a long time. Repeat, like, it's the third option they've renewed.
Yeah.
And most of them never get made. So what happened after you had the discussion, you signed the option, you got a little bit of money, because the option's usually not a big amount. You just stopped there and said, okay, I'm not going to do anything else. I'm just going to ride this, right?
I did not do that. For people that don't know, an option is on the order of thousands. Typically, I would say. I don't know if that jives with your experience, but that's it, and that's nice. But you don't live on that, especially when it only renews every however many months, and then you'll maybe get another few grand later on.
Right.
So, but something about, I don't know if I was just, there's something about this project that always felt inevitable. I tried to keep my hopes where they should have been,
right, and
to remember that most things don't get picked up. But there was, for some reason, even knowing that, there was something about these people and the way they talked and the things that they said and the reports. They've been very, very communicative all the way along. So I felt that it could not happen. That was always a possibility, but that it would be from network crap or something like that. It wouldn't be because it was a whimsical, because things get optioned whimsically. Like, a few $1,000s for a producer is nothing, most producers. And so a lot of people just snap up options like, well, because I want to have a shot and I don't want someone else to grab it, well, I'm kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah.
That isn't how these guys did it. They were like, we're serious about it. We love the property. We have all these ideas. They showed me like a lookbook, which is, the I don't know, basic idea of how it might appear. And they were just always really working it in a way that didn't feel just offhanded. Because I had interest in this book before from a name that you would definitely know the name. And I can tell you when we're done recording, Mark, if you want to hear it. But it was just one of those things where, like, I've heard the expression enthusiasm is free. And it is. And they get all excited. Ooh, are you really excited? But this wasn't that way. And it felt like it was always going to attempt very, very hard to go somewhere. And that's what it did, is it just marched forward, and COVID was in the middle. And so through the worst of COVID, we were just waiting, and people weren't meeting, and they were going to virtual rooms, and it just marched ever slowly forward until it found a home with NBC.
Wow. And it was produced. So here in Canada, now I know it was SyFy that did it, but I got a hold of it on Amazon Prime in Canada, and I know it's not available, or it wasn't available on Amazon Prime in the US. So it was just this weird, like, where am I going to get it here in Canada? Because there's always the different subscription services, and I was really lucky to see it when it premiered. Week to week, we anticipated the new episodes. What was that?
So did we. That was fun.
What was that experience like? You created this book 10 years ago, series of characters. You'd mentioned like that joke. I hope that feels like a joke I wrote. I hope, and you had to pick up the book and go find that joke and go, yeah, they used my joke.
Yeah.
So, that must have been interesting, because when people asking you questions, you're like, I don't remember. I've written 30 or 40 other books since then.
Yeah, exactly. More than that. No, it was surreal. It was and I had gone to see it be shot. So I had met the people, like some of the glitz and glamour and the mystery had been popped like a bubble. Like I did, because that would have added to it. That would have been like, who are these people? What have they created? And the first time I saw any finished footage was at Comic-Con, where I was moderating the Reginald panel, and I had never seen anything. I saw it with a room full of several hundred people on a big screen, just a snippet. And so when I got home,
right?
Yeah, it was just, there was a teaser, but there was also a scene. So they had complete, and I think it was the scene from the pilot where it's Maurice and Reginald on the bridge.
Okay.
And it's after he's turned. I think that was the scene that they showed. And that was just like, mind blown. And but then when I got home and we were, because it was just like you were describing, we had to watch it live. I was like, I don't even know how you watch live TV anymore. And I had to get Sling, because it wasn't on Amazon, which I had, and it's on Hulu now. It wasn't on Hulu before.
Right.
And so I had to get Sling TV so I could get the SyFy channel, because I didn't have cable. And then we had a group that watched it week to week, and it was a group of friends, and they were super supportive and interested. But I had no idea how to watch it. I like, it's such a strange feeling, and I've tried to describe it a few times. It's like, it was surreal, yes. It was unreal, yes. Those are probably kind of the same thing. It was flattering. It was interesting, but mostly, the best way to describe it is I didn't know how to watch it. I was like, is this really, really well done fan fiction? Because there's no way it can be a real show. And that sense of disconnect from reality was so intense that the next morning, it might have been the same night. I wrote the next morning, but it might have been the same night, where I said, I need to watch this again. And I watched it again, and I said, okay, it feels a little bit, because I couldn't follow the dialogue. I was too wrapped up in what the hell is happening in front of me. And I then watched it again a few days later, and I think I watched it 4 or 5 times originally, that pilot. And then I just started watching it again because I'm prepping for a companion podcast that I'm going to do for Reginald the Vampire. So I watched the episode again, and I'm like, oh, I can finally watch this now. Like, it finally looks like a show that isn't somehow tied to this soul cousin of something that I created. It was so strange.
It must have been interesting. So it was shot in Victoria,
yeah,
which is probably more temperate in the winter, but still cold they
Still
don't
cold.
get as much snow.
Mhm.
And I remember because I knew where it was filmed, because I think you had said, hey, I'm going to be in Victoria on the set and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so when Liz and I are watching it, there's scenes where you can see their breath. And I was like, yeah, they were filming this in the middle of winter.
In the
And
middle of the
obviously
night,
in the
too.
middle of, yeah, because vampires, right?
Yeah.
Unless you had an umbrella.
Y- Yeah, I don't know about that one. That feels like stretching credulity a little bit. Like there's a scene where they go to Portland and it's overcast, and I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a,
Practicalities, I think, invaded. Like trying to do everything at night is just too much.
but you got to see, before seeing it, you got to see some of the filming and meet some of the folks behind the scenes.
Yeah, I spent 3 days on the set meeting people and watching them. They've been very inclusive and very welcoming, and they
Right.
were. I was like a kind of a minor celebrity on set. That was weird. Was having people react, "Oh my God, it's Johnny." That was fun.
I know I let out a shriek when I saw on screen, based on the novel Fat Vampire by Johnny V. Truant. I think I took a screenshot
Nice
to
big
share.
credit, right?
Yeah, that's pretty
You
awesome.
know, yeah, it wasn't a flash. I mean, it was big, and what I liked was it doesn't just say based on the novels by, it says based on the Fat Vampire novels by, because it's not the same
Right.
title.
Have the sales, have you noticed since the TV series, have the sales of Fat Vampire done anything positive?
Maybe a little,
Yeah.
I think that, I mean, I'm hoping, I have my fingers crossed that this is just, it's a momentum builder thing. Now they're shooting the second season right now.
Right.
So by the time something gets a second season, it's like, okay, well, this has been vetted a little bit. And if it gets a third, knock on wood, then I think that with books, okay, so I'm actually curious if you have this impression, but I had heard a bunch of times that the fourth book in a series is when you know if it has legs.
Usually third or fourth book. Yes. Yeah.
And for me, it was fourth.
Yeah.
When Fat Vampire 1, 2, 3 were kind of down here, and 4 was like, okay, this is serious. So
Yeah.
maybe it's true with seasons of TV too. So there's been a slight tick up. I can tell that people are buying the box set too, which is $23.
But they want to binge it.
Yeah, I mean, so that's good. I mean, we get the lower commission on that. It's
Well,
above
on every
$2
other
tier.
retailer except the Big River, you're making 70%.
Yeah, that is true. And I'm only watching Amazon because they're the only ones that have the ranking that I can look at.
Oh, you can
And I
see
don't
the
have
ranking.
access to the dashboard. I mean,
But
I'm sure
on
I can.
Apple, you'll make the full, make the full 70%.
Yeah,
So,
and that's great.
so I'm congratulations. This is
Yeah, thank you.
really exciting. You've got the second season of that coming out. Obviously, your name in lights, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not like you stopped, right? You and Sean and Dave have continued with Sterling and Stone, Story Studio, all these different things you've done, including, I mean, some really good friends I have to this day I met at the conferences you guys used to run in
Yeah.
Austin. And so many people. I remember meeting Michael Anderle there for the first time. I think he was doing something to support troops, because I think I negotiated something with him to help get Kobos really cheap for him, so because he was buying Kindles or Kobos to send to support people, and then Michael's done.
Yeah.
He's done okay for himself as well.
He has. He's a good guy. He's a smart guy.
But you guys were at the beginning of everything, and a lot of people in the industry can connect back to that. But you never just rested on your laurels at any point. I mean, you're still producing to this day, right?
Well, yes, and I want to deepen what you're saying, because the implication there is sort of like that I ever had a chance to rest on my laurels. I mean, so I think I'm doing pretty well as an indie author.
Right.
As far as indies, like there's obviously a lot of tiers above where I am, but I think that within my tier, I think I'm a success story.
Right.
That said, I'm certainly not rolling in the dough. I'm not rich. I'm not famous. And as a matter of fact, I don't even know if books are paying all the bills. Like we're doing a bunch of stuff right now. Sterling and Stone's strategy is much more, we loop back around on books. So we're aggressively trying to pitch IP to well, I would use the blanket term Hollywood, but for TV and film.
Right.
And then, the hope is that then once those take off and we get those stories made, I mean, that's its own thing. Like that's exciting. but
Yeah.
then also hopefully the books then rise on the back end. So yeah, I mean, I've never had the chance to rest on my laurels. Like I kind of wish that I'd, when Invasion was really big, we had some really big months, and I suppose that a less a shorter sighted author might be like, okay, well, this is going to last forever, which it doesn't.
Right.
But no, I mean, it's a grind. I don't know what you tell people, but I always still tell people this is not a career you get into to make money.
Right.
Um, I mean, you do it, you hopefully make money, but you do it because you love to do it. You do it because you want to tell stories. And there are people who are able to hack the system, or who are able to really hacking the system. That sounds derogatory. I don't mean it that way, but they're able to do things such that, like Michael
Right.
Anderle, like he's doing good things, but he also has just the right formula that really, has been monetarily successful, and he's not shy about that. Whereas it's a little harder. I mean, I write more offbeat stories. I have a very distinct voice that isn't the same as the commercial voice.
Yeah.
And so all you can do is keep plugging and keep looking at other ways to approach the same thing. You can't just, well, my books will sell or they won't. What else can I do? Who else can I talk to? What else? What other products can I complete this series? Can I bundle it into a box? These are the things we used to think about.
So you'd mentioned this before, and I think this is true about both you and Sean. Is I think passion's very important for you. You both get very passionate about the stories that you want to tell.
Right.
Is that an important element of it, rather than just looking at the analytics and saying, "Oh, there's a market for this, we're going to write this"? And I know there is always that element somewhere, because you can't help that business aspect. But it seems like you more pursue the stories you want to tell, right?
Well, I think we have to. I mean, I've tried to sell out, and not when I say that, I'm being a little tongue in cheek, but I could never just sell out because I'm prolific, and so I would always have my passion projects in it. I would do both. I would be passionate and I would sell out, and we've been extremely unsuccessful in that. Every single time the specific combination of Sean and I, because every time we've tried to do it, it's been the both of us working together. It just There's something about the way that we write. There's something about the stories that we need to tell that they're insistent. They push out through us, and we can't. It always feels like contorting, or sometimes it feels like dumbing down, and it. We just can't do that. Like I like to go into deep concepts and stuff that, big long explanations. Like my characters talk too much. There's too much science, and that comes out no matter what I do. I wrote a project recently that was it was quasi ghost written. I don't want to go into that too much, but the bottom line is it wasn't really my book. And so I gave myself permission to just dash something off, whatever. Well, it's really complicated, and it became a really good book, and I get to take some credit for it too. And that's great as well, but I can't do that. I've tried.
Yeah. You had shared for my 300th episode a really great reflection on the importance of storytellers and why they're so important. Can you just talk a little bit more about why, especially now, that's one of the most important things that the world can have?
Well, I think that there's a lot of people who see various things that they'd like to change in the world, and I'm certainly one of them. There are things that I'm unhappy with, and it can be very frustrating, and people have various ways that they try to deal with that. They either surrender, or they get out and pick up picket signs, or they try to rally people, or they try to go out there and change minds, or they just argue. That's why I'm not on social media. It's just all arguing, people who are never going to change their minds anyway, arguing with each other. And so I was talking about this with my son, who, it was one of those deeper discussions about the world and blah, blah, blah. And he's in arts. And I said, well, you're in a really good position, because I said artists and storytellers are a subset of artists. We're the ones who actually can change the world. And what I mean by that is story is the Trojan horse. Story is something that we all understand, and it feels like something that comes in under the radar. So if you had, I'll just take a real simple example. Let's say you had a diehard racist, and this person was like, well, these people, whatever these people are, this and that, and they have all these ideas about what these people are and how they're subverting this and that. Now, it's important to understand that anybody who has an opinion that you disagree with is not trying to be a bigot. They're not trying to be evil. They're just parsing the world in the way that they understand with what they have. And that means that there's something in them that is justifying their beliefs that you may find so repugnant. And so what you can do is you can try and go full frontal on those people and just be like, listen, let me explain to you why these people that you don't like, why you should like them and why you're wrong about whatever. And that's this left brain attack where you're trying to disassemble a logical argument. And it never works because we have all of these psychological walls that come up and that say that no, you're attacking who I am. That's what you don't understand. You've labeled me as a bigot. You've put me on the wrong side, but I have a valid worldview too. Because if you were where I was, you might feel that too. And so what story does is, in the example of the racist, is it might show, you might watch a movie where there's a character or characters who happen to be whatever race this person has a problem with, who are just portrayed as normal people. They might be funny, they might be tragic, they might be having some of the same struggles as that person does, and it's not forced upon them. I'm not talking about preachy sorts of stories. I'm talking about stories where just things happen, and you get a little more used to it, and you go, oh, subconsciously, you get to the point where it's like, oh, maybe they're just like me. Maybe I don't hate them as much as I do. And that is the way that the world changes. I think that art is this last bold frontier. And I think that we artists are we're subversive. We're like, intentionally or unintentionally, we're secretly turning the screws of the world. And the beautiful part is that nobody realizes it, which is why it's so effective. Because if you take, in America, one of the most common denominators is TV. Like, people of all walks and stripes watch TV or they watch movies. Guess who's creating those TV and movies? It's the artists. It is by and large the group that a lot of the real hardline people who think I'm not going to be changed, the world's too soft, whatever. All those people are making your art, man. All the stuff that you think is so great are being made by these people that you might have a problem with if you ran into them on the street. And that's what I think is so cool, is it feels like this big joke that's on the wider world that we all get to be in on. And I just think that that's fantastic. I think that story is the one way that we really begin to change the world.
I love that. But story is one of the ways that we connect in so many deep and meaningful ways in a non-threatening way, which is fantastic.
You can share a story with somebody even if you are very different from them.
I love that. What a great way as we get close to the end. As we get close to the end, I'm curious to know, what are you optimistic about with projects that are sort of on the horizon for Johnny B. Truant?
Oh, I wish I could tell you that. We do
the things you're allowed to say. Yes.
Yeah, I don't have much that I'm allowed to say. I can be vague, and I can say that we have a bunch of stuff. So Sterling and Stone, I should say from the beginning, I talk in terms of we with Sterling and Stone because it is a group thing, but of
course,
I'm not materially involved in any of the pitching or anything anymore. I am flagship author. That's my thing. Yep. So when I say we, I really mean Sean and Neve, who are running the company. They're out there working with producers and pitching people all the time. And there are various Sterling and Stone projects. Some of them are mine, a lot aren't, that are out there making their way through the big Hollywood machine or the Vancouver machine or whatever it is. And that's all very exciting, but I can't be specific. And I do have one project in particular that I'm really, really excited about. But, the writer's strike that we have going on in the US is really kind of slowing everything down, unfortunately.
Yeah. I was surprised, season 2 is already being shot of Reginald the Vampire, and I know that there were some issues with the writer's strike. So obviously some things had gotten greenlit before the strike, I imagine.
Well, and Modern Story, I believe, is I think it has dual citizenship. Modern Story is the company, is Jeremiah Chechik and Harley Payton. That's their company. And they're the two guys who originally contacted me. And I believe that company is like a dual citizenship thing. And it's all being shot in Victoria. And there are a lot of rules around that. Crew is almost entirely Canadian.
Yeah.
So I think that we're dodging, knock on wood, I think we're kind of dodging a lot of that. But yes, anything that gets into that machine is a big deal. And it's a scared culture, by the way. So, they aren't bold. like TV kind of goes, ooh, we better just get back and we better cower because this thing's going to happen, rather than seeing, guess what, guys, it's going to end at some point and then everybody's going to be hungry. And that's when the opportunity arises.
Oh, man. Awesome. Johnny, can you please share for my listeners where they can find out more about you and Sterling and Stone online?
Sterling and Stone is at sterlingandstone.net. We have a whole host of writers that we're working with. My individual site is at johnnybtruant.com, and I've been kind of tearing it up over there. I started delving a lot into my process. I did this big write-up of the Reginald the Vampire thing that you read. But in addition, I wrote up a 6-part, like really intense behind-the-scenes series for the members of that site. So so johnnybtruant.com is where I am, and I'm real excited about what's going on there.
Awesome. Johnny, thanks for hanging out with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mark. It's a blast.
So there are two things I want to reflect on from the conversation with Johnny. The first one is just going back to that use of story, to more comfortably invite people to see or share a fresh perspective. And I love the way Johnny was talking about sharing that with his son. What a wonderful, wonderful thing for a father to do, to explain, the futility of arguing with someone, but to share the beauty of how you can do that in a story. And it harkened back to, there are many, many studies, but I was looking at, and I'll share a link in the show notes, there's a Discover magazine article by Megan Schmidt from August 2020. And in it, I'm just going to pull some quotes. So this quote is from Keith Oatley, a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of Toronto, here in Ontario, Canada. And Oatley says, reading novels enables us to become better at actually understanding other people and what they're up to. With someone you're married to or a close friend, you can actually get to know them. Reading fiction enables you to sample across a much wider range of possible people and come to understand something about the differences among them. Now, Schmidt goes on in the article to say, fiction has the capacity to transport you into another character's mind, allowing you to see and feel what they do. This can expose us to life circumstances that are very different from our own. Through fiction, we can experience the world as another gender, ethnicity, culture, sexuality, profession, or age. Words on a page can introduce us to what it's like to lose a child, be swept up in a war, be born into poverty, or leave home and immigrate to a new country. And taken together, this can influence how we relate to others in the real world. And I'm so glad that I had a chance to chat with Johnny. He shared the reflection a few episodes ago, got into it in a little bit more detail, but this is a reminder to you, dear listener, that as a writer, you have this amazing power, this amazing responsibility to help bring experiences to other people and help other people learn about something that you can share from your perspective. And that is so powerful and so wonderful and so magical, because at the end of the day, good storytelling is really about bringing people together. And we need so much more of this. We need so much more of bringing people together and providing empathy and compassion. And that's where you come in. And that's why I wanted to reflect a little longer on that, so I can ensure that you understand that value, that critical value of story. The second thing I want to reflect on is, all right, Johnny's in a position that most writers would potentially give their left arm for. Having a book turned into a television show or movie. I mean, that's one of the things you think, oh my God, if only I could get a movie or TV show made from this book or this series, then I will have made it. But I love how he approaches that. It doesn't mean that you've made it. It means it's a cool experience, don't get me wrong, and I love that he shared, even the challenge of how do I approach this? And the surreal elements to it. And there's so much excitement and fun and buzz. But at the end of the day, as a longtime storyteller, this is cool. This is awesome. He's going to enjoy it and reap the benefits of it. But this is not making him more than a successful author. It's not, spotlighting or skyrocketing him into an area where he can just sit back and go, okay, I'm just going to sit on the millions of dollars that are just flowing in every day because of this. So that's the reality of writing and publishing. And the reality is, Johnny is passionate about wanting to tell interesting stories about things that he's interested in and cares about and is passionate about. And that shows. And he's still working at it. He's still moving forward. He's still progressing. He's still persisting in that writing. He's not just, sitting back and saying, yay, a TV show made for my books. Everyone look at me, look at me. No, he's still got the nose to the grindstone. He's still working at it, but he's working at the things he believes in, the things that he loves, and the things that he's very, very passionate about. So, may we all have a TV show or movie based on one of our IPs, one of the things that we've created. But just to know that that's not the end. If something like that happens, that's yet another really cool thing that can happen as a writer. Just like it's a really cool thing when I was at a conference this last weekend. It was a really cool thing when somebody walked up to me with one of my novels from the Canadian Werewolf series and asked if I would sign it. That's really powerful and cool too. And I will take every single little cool and powerful thing that happens to me, because that is one of the things that impassions and empowers me as a storyteller, knowing that people are interested in those stories. People connect with those stories, and I can connect with other people with those stories. So that is it for episode 302. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice. You can share this podcast with someone that you think would find value in it. You can also join the patrons who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections. And a huge thank you to all of the awesome patrons who support this podcast. So like I said, this is the end of this episode. Until next episode 303. Yes, I can do the maths. This is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.